one of the key things that's necessary in becoming more whole as a person, or if you will, spiritual being, is the removing of assumed personalities, identities, personas. There are a lot of different words you could use. Created synthetic selves. Very key thing to do to become whole and to be fully present. And I have a technique I've developed which works very, very well. And I wanted to touch on some of the principles involved, the history of the development of the technique, and bring about a better understanding for those who would use this technique, as well as those who would be interested in taking advantage of this processing to become more whole, to quote unquote find yourself, which I think is somewhat of a misnomer of a phrase, because we think of finding yourself as finding the defined set of characteristics that define you. And I'm not so sure that there is such a thing other than what we assume. And what we assume, we internally program into ourselves, just takes away from the wholeness and the openness to all that we can be and all that we can experience. Kind of locks us in to the limited parameters of any set way of being. Well, speaking from my own experiential background, I did some reading, looking, researching on spiritual practices and psychology and therapy from my teens on. And I did become involved for quite a while in the subject of Scientology, which I look at as a stepping stone. I do not regret all that I experienced through that, nor would I recommend it. But everything we've been through is part of what has brought us to where we are now. And it was in many ways a valuable stepping stone. There were principles, ideas, and techniques about the mind and the spirit, which I embraced at the time. I can say that I very well mastered the subject. I spent quite a long time being quite a good and effective Scientology counselor, within the parameters, limitations, and I will say misdirections that I now recognize, or had come to recognize since that time. And in relation to the technique I've evolved for removing layers of false personalities. In relation to that, in Scientology and Dianetics, which Dianetics is considered to be a subsection of Scientology, they use the term valence for false self or false personality, because of the creator Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, using that word from Latin meaning a strength, something that a person takes for strength or protection. Not entirely wrong, but that's not all there is to it. Hubbard was quite paranoid, quite fearful, And in his mind, everything was about fighting off all those he considered to be a threat. It was pretty much everybody. But I stray from the subject here. In the mid to late 1950s, Hubbard in Scientology, actually through his son at the time, imported into Scientology what is actually a meditation technique, although like all or most of Scientology was taken from one source or another and rewritten and codified and presented as a new discovery by Hubbard. And this meditation technique is called in Scientology TRs, which is short for training routines. And Hubbard presented it as not as, in his words, processing, not as something to evolve and expand a person mentally or spiritually. He presented it as training for how to be in conducting a Scientology session with a session practitioner and the person participating in the session, which they called a pre-clear. Anyway, the technique, which is a meditation technique, in its original form, which then Hubbard changed and, in my view, corrupted through many different variations. He created a series of TRs, but the basic technique is to be there with and in front of another person, silently, motionlessly, and he called it confronting. I think confronting is a bad choice of words and explains why so frequently the technique wasn't done well, because confronting suggests confrontation. It suggests opposition. And that goes back to Hubbard's paranoia that everyone was a threat. And Hubbard's not the only person to think of the idea of maintaining one's presence as something to do to fight off the presences of others. But when this technique is done successfully, a person can be at ease without resorting to any mental exercises or tricks or solutions of holding oneself a certain way, emanating a certain attitude, or taking anything on other than just simply being there, relaxed, and having the other person's presence with yours. That's the basic idea. Although the word presence was never used, and as I said, the technique was largely corrupted and misrepresented as merely something to train people to operate Scientology sessions with other people. You know, its real value is exactly what Hubbard tried to say it wasn't, which was as processing. You know, to process, or in my words, spiritually digest whatever is present, to have it without resorting to defending against it, coming up with things to project about who or whatever is around you, which takes one out of being present. So there was a person who became very important to Scientology, who in fact contributed quite a bit to it, named Alan Walter. And Alan Walter, I would estimate, contributed about 30% of what people know as Scientology, although Hubbard, of course, claims to have come up with it all by himself. And eventually, as anyone who shined too brightly in Hubbard's kingdom, Alan was thrown under the bus and pushed out in very unkind fashion, but that's another story. But what Alan eventually did was to create his own paradigm, which he called knowledgeism. Knowledgeism is a kind of Scientology 2.0. It actually does more good. It has less misdirections and misconceptions and is much less about actually sort of indoctrinating a person to be submissive to the cult of Hubbard. Alan also, through his experience in Scientology with Hubbard, kind of became a bit like him, and in that way, a lot of what he created was not as pure as it could have been if he wasn't caught up in trying to outdo Hubbard or kind of win the battle, so to speak. But nevertheless, Alan Walter was quite brilliant. And these techniques, one of the techniques that, or several of the techniques that Alan evolved were what he called presence, which is the right name for it. And the first step of presence, which I believe was called Presence 1, was basically that meditation technique, only reworded to be more purely what it was intended to be in the first place. To able to simply be present and have that which is present. And that pretty much is everything. That pretty much is everything we're trying to accomplish spiritually, at least as I see it through my practice, which I call therapeutic spiritual counseling. And this brings us around to the subject at hand, which is the removing of layers of assumed false personalities or identities. We all have many of these, and they inhibit us. They take us out of fully being present and substituting a created or synthetic presence, which sort of encapsulates us in only being able to see through the filter of that particular layer of personality, to only perceive and understand and everything through the color of the moods and attitudes of that personality. So Presence 1 is about sitting there in front of another person and just having their presence. It's the simplest thing in the world. We all tend to complicate it because we have our anxieties and, we have our collection of fears, anxieties, and projections that we have created our own internally programmed solutions for, which you could call resolutely held protective attitudes. And a layer of false personality is a type of resolutely held protective attitude. So Alan created a technique among these that I had particular interest in, that I actually evolved my technique out of, although it's really not even recognizable from the original base of Alan's technique, because I've corrected so many things and taken out so many things and added, innovated steps that Alan hadn't thought of, that are vitally important to the process of truly removing layers of false personalities. But this originally was built out of the framework of Alan's Presence 3. So let me give credit where credit is due for that. Although, as I said, with all the changing and evolving that I've done to make it so much more thorough and so much more efficient and effective, it wouldn't even be recognized as that. And as far as the subject of false personalities and removing these layers of false personalities, a couple of vital bits of information. A false personality, let's call it a persona for the moment, a persona doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it doesn't exist alone. A persona, taken on, what it is it's an internal program to be a particular thing, you could say, a particular identity or personality. It exists paired with another identity or personality that it interacts with, that it engages with, that it exists to contest with, to in a game with the other persona, the other personality. And to truly process and remove layers of false personality, the essential thing is really the game, whatever it may be, that these two beingnesses, these two personas, are engaged in opposing each other, contesting each other within. And this is why I approach this a certain way. We take up all the steps that I've put together for processing away a particular identity, a particular persona that has captured or encapsulated a person into acting through and seeing everything through. And there are steps of questions in this, including what effect, what way is this person, this persona, seeking to be recognized, regarded, and treated by others. Every persona, every personality, it exists to elicit a certain way of being regarded by others. To be left alone, to be feared, to be respected, to be loved, to be admired, on and on. Okay? So we get that question answered in the session by the person I'm conducting the session with. And then I ask, what type of person, could be phrased different ways, what type of person is this identity of yours seeking to get that response to itself from? What kind of person is the person that they're projecting to be the person or identity that they want to be treated or regarded that way by? And what I'm really asking for is to bring out the corresponding identity, the other identity, the identity that this identity exists in a game with. Because everybody in processing, having an identity, also has the corresponding identity, and they will alternate between one and the other in different times of their life, in different situations, and so forth. And you can't fully remove a layer of assumed personality without removing the corresponding personality as well, and more completely without processing away the game that these identities are engaged in playing with each other. It's such a huge and wonderful feeling of liberation, spiritual freedom, and ascension. It's a wonderful feeling. Anytime a client in the session comes to that point where we process away the underlying game, because that underlying game for the individual is the whole world as they see it, as they know it. It's the playing field. It's this scenario in which everything is and occurs. And of course it's false, it's a bubble, and it imposes certain moods and realities. And it's so amazing to transcend that and be free of that. I understood that would be when I recognized for myself that these were the underlying mechanics, and I've seen that consistently happen when this occurs in a session. It's huge, and it's wonderful, and it's just a giant, giant step toward becoming fully whole and fully present, and it feels wonderful. Boy, does it feel wonderful. Another thing I want to point out, and this is perhaps mostly for people I'm training to master these techniques and be practitioners. I've always got people I'm training. I came to recognize just a couple of years ago maybe that one of the things that sticks a person to these false personalities is a feeling that they can't be without it, an attitude that says, I've got to hold on to this. I'm not safe without it. I can't be without this. I must have it. And I've noticed sort of the energies or feelings of this coming up in the sessions I've been doing for years, which were successful to remove these layers of false personality. But until I recognized this aspect, it was much more work to get there. And this aspect is simply a resolutely held protective attitude, as I call it. And I have a well-established technique I've evolved years ago for processing away resolutely held protective attitudes. So there's a certain step in doing this processing where I will ask, is there some thought, idea, or attitude you have that says that you can't risk letting go of this attitude, that you need to have it to be safe, to be okay? And it always comes up that there is one, and we process that, and then it's very easy to have that false self process away, just drop away. And it's very much a part of the procedure. There's a certain step in removing layers of false personality. And this step does come from Alan Walter, where essentially we repeat alternating questions. Where is this identity right now? Where are you? How big is this identity now? How big are you? The end result of this, which I do it differently than Alan, Alan would take this just to a point where the person was no longer feeling smaller than the identity, but was feeling bigger. Alan had the idea that taking on false ways of being, as long as you were conscious of it, was good or useful or something like that. I have a different philosophy about that, which is there is nothing that trumps actually simply being fully present in the moment. You don't need a program, a preconceived plan, anything that takes you out of recognizing the uniqueness of the moment, which fully prepares you to act accordingly with whatever may be occurring. And there's nothing more successful, more natural, easier, and that works better than just being fully present rather than falling into some triggered response. So even though Alan was thinking in terms of maintaining or creating identities and stepping in and out of them consciously, that's still entering into a program. And that, to me, is obviously not the best way to be. Okay, so this step that I'm talking about, where Alan created this, or at least I got it from Alan. Where is this personality? Where are you? How big are they? How big are you? It should easily go to the point where the presence of that other self, that beingness, is gone altogether. That's what I take it to. That's what it should be taken to. And I noticed that sometimes, not infrequently in sessions, this would become a wrestling match between the person and that particular identity they were processing. Where for a while, they'd be getting bigger, the identity would be getting smaller, and the identity would be going further and further away. But then it would come back, and then it would get bigger, and they'd get smaller. And I simply would continue the process, sometimes over an hour, on that one step, until we arrived at successfully being present with no presence of that identity anymore. But it was clearly, I could feel and see, it was like a wrestling match between the being and that identity. There was a lot of push and push back going on. And the way I conduct a session, one principle of mine is it should never feel like work. If it feels like work, something's being entered into it that doesn't belong. And so what I realized maybe a year and a half ago was that there was some resolutely held protective attitude, some idea the person had embedded in themselves, accepted and taken on, that they needed to maintain that persona. And that was what was turning it into such a wrestling match. I recognized this at one point during one session, and I asked that question of the person: is there some thought, idea, or attitude you have that says that you can't or shouldn't let go of this identity? And that brought up what they had in their minds that felt and held on to and insisted on that. And then we processed that resolutely held protective attitude with the technique I have for that. And then going back to that process, how big is that identity? How big are you? Where is that identity? Where are you? The identity then vanished almost immediately. So that showed me that a key factor here is this desperation within the person, this unprocessed desperation through which they create an attitude that I'm not letting this go, I can't let it go, it protects me, things like that. So that is why that is now part of the procedure of removing layers of false personalities. See, when we're doing that step, bigger, smaller, where are you, where is it? If that just goes smoothly and easily and the identity vanishes, then we don't interject taking up the resolutely held protective attitude in the middle of that process. We just complete the process. If it does get sticky and going back and forth, and you can see there's a struggle here, the identity is persisting, it's getting bigger, it's getting smaller, bigger, smaller, it's not going away, it's going on for a while, then we interject and we take care of that by finding and addressing the resolutely held protective attitude. If we don't need to do that to get through that step, then we wait until that step is done, and then we still ask for and process that resolutely held protective attitude. Because one of the key properties of a resolutely held protective attitude is that it will hold in place some fear, some anxiety, some sort of programming that takes a person out of presence. And even if you process that fear, that anxiety, whatever that may be, without addressing the underlying attitude, then those feelings will be recreated by that attitude, because that attitude demands it. So in any case, where there are layers of false personality, we are going to do our job fully for the individual and ask for and process the underlying resolutely held protective attitude. And my recognizing and using this actually leads to, it makes the whole procedure of removing layers of false personality so much more efficient, easier, and quicker, that it enables me to remove quite a few other steps of the procedure that basically came from Alan's framework, which are now unnecessary and don't add to the procedure. So that's, I think that's as much as I will cover in this one video. It's a bit for you to absorb and digest, especially if you're one of my session clients. I know you'll find this interesting. If you're one of my trainees, one of the people I'm mentoring, watch this more than once. And for anyone who's just watching this out of interest, I hope you find it informative and enlightening. And please feel free to see what else is on my website, my YouTube, and reach out to me if you're so inclined.